Fake news. Two words making up one of the most important phrases of the last decade. It arguably was one of the things that defined the 2016 election. And I'm talking about the term, not misleading media itself. Of course, that was happening. But the ability to discount a news story with that one term showed just how divisive Americans and our media sources truly were. People started to distrust journalists altogether. We saw digital echo chambers flourish. Perhaps people often cherish the glory days of Walter Cronkite and Peter Jennings a bit too much, but there's something to be said about our current lack of trust in media. It's gotten worse. Individuals and companies have been targeted, and in general, being a journalist in the United States is more difficult than it used to be. For the past 20 years, there's actually been a way to get a fairly accurate understanding of overall freedom of the press. In 2002, Reporters Without Borders, an international nonprofit aimed at safeguarding the right to freedom of information, released their first World Press Freedom Index, a ranking system designed to determine overall press freedom of a country. Through asking the same 50 questions to journalists, researchers, and legal experts in each country, they came up with a chart of 139 nations. Others were not included due to a lack of reliable information. In this very first chart, the United States ranked 17th. Not as good as a place like Scandinavia, where all four countries ranked in the top 10, but still, not bad. By the mid-aughts, the United States was in the 40s, reaching a low of 48th in 2019. Today, it ranks 44 out of 180 listed countries. While I suppose I could go down the rabbit hole of trying to break down how this came to be in the most unbiased way possible, I don't really want to do that. I feel like I'd sound like I had an agenda no matter what I say. So instead, I thought it would be interesting to look at three countries that rank ahead of us and what they're doing successfully. But I didn't want to just pick the top three in the world, which currently is Norway, Finland, and Sweden, followed by Denmark. All wealthy nations nearby in location and similar in political views and economic systems. Instead, I want to take a look at three countries throughout the world that are not necessarily the wealthiest or have the highest life expectancies, traits many countries in the top 25 of press freedom have in common, to see how nations from a number of circumstances have managed to operate a successful fourth estate. As the United States is hopefully moving in the right direction in this category, perhaps a small deep dive into some other countries can provide insight as to the complications our country has faced as of recent and what we can do to avoid repeating mistakes of the past. To start, I wanted to look at the predominantly English-speaking nation with the highest world press freedom ranking, Jamaica. Coming in at 7th overall, Jamaica has maintained a high level of press freedom over the last decade. The island's esteemed status may come as a surprise to some. When I was doing research, at one point I simply typed in the word Jamaica, and at the top of the list were things like, why is Jamaica so dangerous? And what should I avoid in Jamaica? Followed by, is Jamaica an African country? Which just clearly there's a ton of misinformation regarding the Caribbean nation. Of course, Jamaica has its issues, as any nation does. Predominantly fueled by organized crime violence, Jamaica has the third highest murder rate in the world, and yet a journalist has not been killed in the country since the early 2000s. While I found a report of police officers, quote, overstepping power boundaries twice in 2009, nothing in the last decade suggests any journalist has been subject to violence. I couldn't find anything. In fact, when I searched police target Jamaican journalists, the first thing that pops up is an article by the Jamaican Observer titled, Journalists Covering U.S. Protests Find Themselves Under Attack, referencing the widespread events of the last year following the murder of George Floyd. As I mentioned, the United States currently sits in the mid-40s, well below other wealthy nations like Canada, Luxembourg, Ireland, and Switzerland. Of course, there's rich countries like Qatar and Singapore that are far worse, but the drop in rankings by nearly 30 spots in 20 years is concerning. In 2018, the United States tied India as the fifth deadliest country in the world for journalists, with 6 members of the press dying in both countries. The U.S.'s place here was largely due to the mass shooting at the Capitol Gazette on June 28, 2018, so this year could be considered an outlier, but still quite concerning, especially since while another mass shooting directed at a media-based company has not occurred, there's been continued violence against members of the press in recent times. Last year in particular, the United States saw some of the most intense state-sanctioned attacks on the press in the history of the country. As protesters rallied nationwide, and clashes between protesters and police became a regular occurrence, numerous members of the press were assaulted, with the wide majority of violence coming from the police, and in certain places, the National Guard, as well as other, at times unidentifiable officers. According to the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, in just the days between May 26 and June 6, 2020, a reported 328 press freedom violations occurred throughout the country. By the end of the last year, there's been a recorded 139 arrests and/or detainments of journalists, 428 assaults, not all by state officials, of course, but still, the World Press Freedom Index isn't just concerned with government policies, it also pays attention to the public's view of the press. I was not able to find statistics on journalists assaulted in Jamaica. The only thing I could find was a quote from the World Press Freedom Index that read, "Except for a few rare attacks on journalists, no real acts of violence or threat to press freedom has been reported in the country since February 2009. This date being the last time police officers were reported to undermine press freedom. I tried searching a number of phrases that might lead me to a story of a member of the press being attacked by anyone, but each time I just found a Jamaican newspaper reporting on journalists being attacked in another country. Jamaica does a few things that makes them stand out. In 2013, they became the first independent Caribbean nation to decriminalize defamation laws. This was huge, as no criminal lawsuit can be made against anyone, including members of the press, for libel, a published false statement that damages a person's reputation. In places around the world, libel can get people arrested, jailed, or even considered a terrorist in certain situations. In Jamaica, now only civil lawsuits can be made, and even then, they seem to want to avoid that, as one of the bill's goals is to, quote, introduce non-litigious methods of resolving disputes, including a procedure for making amends for an apology to the aggrieved person. The majority of countries around the world have some form of criminal defamation law. Even in the US, while laws differ state to state and libel is pretty difficult to prove, criminal libel still exists in certain areas. If anyone has seen the movie The People vs. Larry Flynt, it's about Flynt, the publisher of Hustler magazine, and a lawsuit that came about after he published a parody ad in which they jokingly claimed that prominent Christian televangelist Jerry Falwell's first sexual experience was with his mother in an outhouse while, quote, drunk off our God-fearing asses. It's obviously a joke, but the case made its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. Ultimately, Hustler won and never had to pay Falwell any damages. I don't think Jamaican politicians necessarily had cases like this in mind when they decriminalized all defamation, but the ability to increase freedom of speech for the press and reduce punishment for journalists was seen as a step forward for the country. When Jamaica first began publishing newspapers in the 18th and 19th century, they were written for and by white colonists. However, following the abolition of slavery in the 1830s, a growing black nationalist movement saw black Jamaicans work and strive for a greater political voice. Part of this included creating their own newspaper publications, having an ability to share thoughts and ideas with the masses. Perhaps the initial struggle to have their voices heard, and the nearly 200-year history of black-owned and published newspapers, is a reason why culturally there seems to be more reverence towards journalism than in many other places. Whatever the case, Jamaica has maintained liberal policies regarding the press for years, and remains one of the beacons of freedom throughout the Western Hemisphere. As I mentioned, cumulatively, Europe has the highest levels of press freedom of any continent. However, while certain regions have pretty poor scores, Africa is the only other continent to have at least 5 countries ranked ahead of the United States. So, I thought it would be a good idea to look at the highest ranking country in the continent, Namibia. Coming in 24th internationally, the country deals with state-created complications but also sees pro-media rulings from their courts. Namibia has long been a part of pursuing improved journalistic standards. Like Jamaica, Namibia dealt with foreigners running the largest news publications for some time. Initially by Germans writing about German imperial forces, then by South Africa, when the territory was named Southwest Africa. In 1990, the Republic of Namibia became an independent nation. Then, in 1991, the country hosted the Windhoek Declaration, a statement by African journalists that served as an affirmation to their commitment to freedom of the press. It's the first of a number of declarations that have been made around the world, with various regions following suit. As one of the lesser populated countries in Africa, Namibia boasts quite a large number of media outlets for its population size, with multiple TV stations, daily newspapers, and quite a few radio stations. Since being ranked in overall press freedom at 36th in 2009, the country has remained in the top 25 for the last decade. Journalists have not faced any physically violent actions in recent years, and although media sometimes clashes with members of government, their court systems heavily defend journalism. For example, in 2019, courts ruled that the government could not use national security as a reason to withhold information from the public. After experiencing verbal threats from the current administration, including the Namibian president's spokesperson, media members created the Namibian Journalists Union earlier this year, the first of its kind since the country became independent. Because there is often conflict between media and government, some criticize the fact that there are still state-sponsored media companies operating in Namibia. While state-run media is fairly common, even certain broadcast stations in the US are state-run, it will be interesting to see how the Namibian government runs their outlets as journalists continue to combat any form of silencing. I should be clear to note, I am not implying journalists working for state-owned media are mindless sheep. In fact, in 2019, after a story was released that officials had been taking bribes in exchange for access to Namibia's fishing grounds, multiple arrests of businessmen and officers were made. However, one of the journalists involved in breaking the story was fired from the state-owned news agency he worked for, while the government accused the media of waging a campaign against the government. Although life expectancy and healthcare both rank in the latter half of nations internationally, they have an extremely low murder rate, and Namibia tends to be a peaceful place to live. Because much of their goods are imported, the cost of living is quite high, and often companies create borderline monopolies as they, in conjunction with the government, control what comes into the country and how much they sell it for. For the Namibian press, it seems one of their main goals is combating state-sanctioned corruption, and based on the zero physical attacks they have faced in recent times, it seems they are widely supported by the general population. The last country I want to focus on is the first nation on the list after Scandinavia, as currently, all 4 nations make the top 4. Across the Atlantic Ocean, in Central America, it is Costa Rica that takes 5th. Listed 15th in the original 2002 World Press Freedom Index ranking, Costa Rica has spent the last 2 decades improving safety and access for journalists while also advancing human rights as a whole. In the mid-20th century, Costa Rica both signed the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights and established a national constitution. These were big steps. However, after decades of seeing constitutional rights stepped on without ramification, they created a constitutional court in 1989 meant to protect all rights listed. Overall, Costa Rica holds a high place internationally in human rights as well as criminalizing discrimination based upon gender, race, and sexual orientation. While same-sex marriage was only just legalized in 2020, it's been legal to be in a same-sex relationship for half a century. I think back to when I was in high school and did a homestay program in the country, and at the time, the debate of same-sex marriage was being heavily discussed. My homestay mother asked me my opinion, and this was before same-sex marriage had passed in the United States. Unsure of her politics, delicately, I tried to say I supported it. She replied, "Well, I don't mind if they live together. I just don't think they should get married, 'cause that's against God." It was a take that I had never really heard before, but I could understand her perspective. A middle-aged religious woman, but also from Costa Rica, she had her ideas, but never said anything about wanting to punish or arrest anybody for doing what they did. I know it's an anecdotal memory, but in general, in both my stay and in research, you don't find a lot of extremism in any one way in Costa Rica, especially in the mainstream. This lack of aggressive political conflict may be why Costa Rican journalists experience some of the best treatment in the world. While Jamaica remains the only country in the Americas with entirely decriminalized defamation laws, Costa Rican criminal defamation cannot result in prison time. The nation also has instances where the public directly helps media's improved freedom. In 2012, the government enacted the Information Crimes Law, which could land people in jail for publishing secret political information. It was a vague law meant to combat organized and cybercrime, but was met with intense backlash. After the outcry, the government announced the law would not apply to journalists, and the following year, the bill was eliminated altogether, in a clear example of the country's values. Due to its geographical location, Costa Rica has experienced increased organized crime activity and violence, as any drugs coming from South America to the United States by land must go through Costa Rica by default. Despite being without an organized military since 1949, the Costa Rican government has maintained stability even as several other Central American nations now have some of the highest murder rates on Earth. Certain officials believe this could be a growing problem if not handled effectively, and if that happens, well, those regions tend to be some of the most dangerous for journalists. Under cartel control, things like defamation can result in death. Costa Rica has actually continued to improve in its ranking on the World Press Freedom Index, so despite some concern, these issues have yet to affect media freedom. Hopefully they never do. As a beacon of both press freedom and human rights as a whole in Latin America, as well as the rest of the world, this small nation has done immense work to create a just society. Of course, they still struggle on a number of issues, as any place does, but especially regarding political freedom and freedom of speech, they excel. When I was in college, I actually had the privilege of hearing former Costa Rican President Oscar Arias speak at my university. In the 80s, when several neighboring countries were in armed conflicts, largely as a result of influences of both the United States and the Soviet Union, thanks to seemingly endless proxy wars fought in Latin America as a result of the Cold War as a whole. But yes, anyways, while that was happening, Arias won the 1987 Nobel Peace Prize for playing an important role in working with the leaders of Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Panama, and Nicaragua to help limit the size of each nation's army while also ensuring they all had freedom of the press and held free and open elections. Since a number of factors, cartel violence being at the forefront, have hindered progress in various parts of the region. But still, the fact that without a military, the Costa Rican government has still found a way to positively impact violent conflicts is incredible. I know this is branching off from simply freedom of the press, but I mention all of this because I truly believe it is all connected. Some of the worst ranked nations on the Freedom Press Index, including North Korea, Turkmenistan, and Eritrea, are home to governments with some of the worst track records on free elections, religious and ethnic discrimination, and simply overall poor human rights. Currently, I think the United States has one of the most complicated relationships to the press in the entire world. I haven't done a poll, but I'd be willing to guess we utter the most free speech cries per capita in the world. And yet, currently, it's hard to find a single person in the country satisfied with media in our country as a whole. In 2020, nearly 400 journalists were assaulted and over 130 were detained, which are unprecedented numbers since the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker began logging data. While I cannot agree with the violence or jailings, I can understand people's frustration with the media. Cable news and sensationalism now seem to go hand in hand. I'd argue that in a lot of ways, they've always been chasing the bottom dollar, and currently this is just what sells, but chicken or egg, it's a problem. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw the amount of YouTube and Facebook, quote-unquote, experts and journalists skyrocket. Different polls and surveys offer different numbers, but at this point, it seems roughly 15 to 20% of our population find the QAnon conspiracy theory to be partly or mostly true. Local news, including broadcast television and print media, have declined vastly in the digital age. I know there's lots of jokes about hokey regional anchors and all that, but I really think there's something to be said about people living in the place they cover. I think it means something. After all, does anyone truly think Wolf Blitzer, Tucker Carlson, or Rachel Maddow give a flying fuck about what's going on in your town? And honestly, nor should they. It's not their job. But that's the point. Ratings have shown we are far less invested in reading or watching content focusing on local stories, local government, issues that often have more impact on us and affect us far more greatly than anything we watch on nationalized TV. The political climate in the United States is such that I think the public's relationship with press is a symptom of a larger issue of overall distrust of the other. There is no one answer, but there's a few things several of my professors passed on to me that I think can help. To start, I would say start watching more local news. Beyond being more well-informed about your community, I think it can take the focus off of large issues that can get two people arguing, and yet neither really has much of an ability to affect change on that topic. Find nonprofit watchdog groups and other outlets that aren't owned by billionaires. Find local journalists who you trust. Best thing about that is, you're far more likely to have your voice heard by these people anyways. Just about every journalist in the country has an email and a social media account, and you're definitely more likely to get a hold of one of those with a smaller audiences than anybody you see on national television. The United States has dropped nearly 30 spots on the World Press Freedom Index since its first publication in 2002, and it's not going to get better without the support of the general public. I know this is becoming sort of a washed out call to action, but as with so many issues, while there are powers that be larger than any single one of us, I really believe that taking concerted efforts as a collective is the best way to strive forward as we hopefully start to move in the right direction. Fickle Future is written, edited, and produced by me, Ruben Estrada. Music by Hobby Beats. You can find all of his work on Linktree/HobbyBeats. The URL is located in the episode's description. Cover art by Alora Batson. As always, thank you for listening.